Oh, forgot to unmute myself. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Robert Spencer. And today we'll be talking about his book, The Critical Qur'an, explained from key Islamic commentaries and contemporary historical research. The link to purchase the book will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. And with that being said, Robert, thank you for joining me today.
Good to see you again, Jacob. Thank you.
And likewise, thank you, Robert. I just want to start us off with this. When you first looked at the Quran in the context of putting together the list of contradictions or problematic verses, what are some of the few ones that stuck out to you the most?
Well, there are different kinds of problematic verses. And so from the standpoint of national security or of the security of non-Muslims in general, you've got all the martial verses, such as Quran 9, verse 29, chapter 9, verse 29, which is the command to wage war against the people of the book, that is primarily Jews and Christians, and to subjugate them under the hegemony of Islamic law, making them pay the jizya, a tax, and feel themselves subdued, which in practice historically has meant submit to a series of humiliating and discriminatory regulations that mandated their second-class status, reminded them of their second-class status at all times, and gave them an impetus to convert to Islam because that was the way you could be free from all this discrimination. So that's one category. And in that you've got things like when you meet the unbelievers, strike the necks, which is chapter 47, verse 4, and kill them wherever you find them, which is 2:191, 489, 491, and kill the mushrikeen, that is the people who associate partners with Allah, that's 9:5. So you got all that, and then you have the discrimination against women and the passage about beating women from whom you fear disobedience. That's what chapter 4, verse 34 says. And that is, in other words, you don't even have to have actual disobedience, just that you're afraid that this woman might come to disobey you at some time in the future, so you can beat her. You've also got, in connection with the mistreatment of women, the passages about the captives of the right hand, who are women who are non-Muslims, who are pressed into sex slavery. Chapter 4, verse 3, 424, 23, 1-6, 33:50, and 70:30 deal with that. And they basically indicate that you can have sexual relations with your wives as well as with these captives of the right hand, who are the spoils of war. And so you might think, well, that's something then that can only take place in the context of a shooting war. Unfortunately, the Quran delineates essentially a state of war between Muslims and non-Muslims that exists at all times. Then you've got the devaluation of women. In 2:282, a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man. In 4:11, the woman inherits only half of what a man inherits. In 65:4, you've got the allowance for child marriage. In actually a regulation about divorce that says that you divorce a woman, you have to wait 3 months to see if she's pregnant. And this is something that is stipulated also even for women who have not yet menstruated, which is indicating that you are marrying and divorcing prepubescent girls. And so that is problematic in that way. Then there are statements that are problematic from a scientific standpoint, such as chapter 18, verse 82, I believe it is, but I'm not sure. It's in chapter 18 in any case, about the sun setting in a muddy pool when Dul-Qarnayn, Alexander the Great, goes to the ends of the earth. And so we have the earth being flat, the sun revolving around it. You have the passages about semen being formed between the backbone and the ribs. You have various other passages of this kind. There was another one that just flew out of my mind. But anyway, you get the idea. So it really depends on what you mean by problematic, but there are all manner of problematic passages of different kinds in the Quran.
Now, some try to say that, well, elsewhere in the Quran, well, it does say this. And this is what this gets into the contradictory parts, where it's telling Muslims to let the Jews and Christians believe what they believe, let them follow their scriptures. Well, how does it say that in one place and then command you to force others to believe it in other places?
It doesn't actually command you to force others to believe. Forced conversion is forbidden in Islamic law. The idea is the subjugation of the non-Muslims under the hegemony of Islamic law. And that's what actually I was describing a moment ago, that the law of Islam stipulates a series of humiliating and discriminatory regulations for the people of the book, which is Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, a few other groups. And they can live in the Muslim society and practice their religions. They are not entirely free. They don't have equality of rights with Muslims. For example, they are forbidden to make any public display of their festivals. And so they are also forbidden to have bells on the churches. So you have churches in Europe, and they have big, if you know anything about European Catholicism and even how it's transferred to America in some areas, there are a lot of pageants and religious festivals and so on throughout the year. When I lived in the Bronx in New York City, I lived in an Italian neighborhood for some years, and every year they would have a big procession with the statue of Mary, the Mother of God, and so on. A very big deal, and the booths with the baked goods everywhere, and everybody's having a party. This kind of thing is forbidden in Islamic law, and so you don't actually have in the tradition of Orthodox churches that are in the Islamic world, you don't see that. You see it when they're in Greece, when they're outside the Islamic world. But in the Islamic world, they do not make any public display because it's forbidden in Islamic law. But they can practice their religions as long as they're quiet and subtle about it, unobtrusive, don't bother the Muslims with bells and processions and so on. And so this is the idea of leaving them, that you can leave them in their religions. It's very sharply circumscribed. They have to be subject to all this discrimination, which is designed to show them that how Allah is punishing them for rejecting Islam. And all they have to do to be free of this punishment in this world is to convert to Islam.
Does the Quran contradict in some ways, or frequently contradicts the Old Testament?
Yeah. See, this is a big problem for the Muslims in general, and has been throughout history. It's been getting a lot of attention lately as the so-called Islamic dilemma, but it's not really a new idea. I wrote about it some 20 years ago in my book Islam Unveiled, and it is something that's been well known. I remember first reading about it in the early 80s when I was first beginning to study Islam. And this is the idea that the Quran says that it is the confirmation of the Torah and the gospel. And so you would expect, when you read the Old Testament and the New Testament, that they would confirm the text of the Quran. That is, you'd expect it as a Muslim, because that's what the Quran says, that it confirms the earlier scriptures. But of course it doesn't. What is taught in the Old Testament, what is taught in the New Testament, is not what is taught in the Quran. And so nowadays, Muslims will tell you, and throughout history actually, Muslims will tell you that the Jews and the Christians have actually dared to corrupt their scriptures. They have changed the text of the Torah and the gospel so as to obscure its congruence with the Quran, because they're so anti-Muslim. And the big problem, and this is what the Islamic dilemma is that the Quran itself tells Muslims that they should abide by the Torah and the gospel. That if they even want to know whether the Quran is true, they should go check with the people of the book. This is chapter 10, verse 94, and there are also some passages in chapter 5 about how the Quran is confirmed by confirms the earlier scriptures and is confirmed by them, so that the Christians will never be rightly guided unless they follow the Gospels. And so that, of course, assumes that the uncorrupted Gospels existed at the same time that the Quran is being written. And yet we have manuscripts of the Old Testament and the New Testament that predate the Quran and are not different from the Old Testament and New Testament today. And that explodes the whole idea that they've been corrupted. They existed at the time of the formation of Islam in exactly the same form in which they exist today. And consequently, the Quran's claim that you will never be rightly guided unless you follow, to the Christians, that you'll never be rightly guided unless you follow the gospel, well, that leads you to the Gospels of the New Testament. And that contradicts Islam. And so this is the dilemma that's been talked about so much lately, that the Quran tells you to follow scriptures that contradict the Quran, and thus the Quran is false by its own testimony.
In a question I asked earlier, I misspoke when I asked about forceful conversion. What I meant to ask is, how do Muslims attempt to rationalize the Quran stating to leave Jews and Christians to their own scriptures and to look to them to check your own text? How do they try to rationalize their way out of that problem? And my second part to that question is, how can they attempt to convince Jews and Christians of their own of the Muslim version of the Islamic faith if they're being told these things by the Quran?
Well, I'm not quite sure I understand the first part of your question. Can you please restate that?
Sure. My question is, how do Muslims rationalize the Quran stating that there's not an issue with Jewish and Christian texts if in another place it says they were corrupted? So how could it be both corrupted and then not corrupted in other places? And how could they try to sway them, convince them of the Islamic faith, given that?
Well, yeah. See, the Quran doesn't actually say that the Jews and Christians corrupted their scriptures. It says that they have forgotten a part. It says that they're misinterpreting the scriptures, but it doesn't say they're corrupted. It doesn't say they're not corrupted either, but it assumes it when it refers the Christians to the Gospels, and when it tells Muslims who are in doubt or Muhammad. It's unclear who is being referred to in chapter 10, verse 94. But the idea is that if you're in doubt concerning what is being revealed to you, then go and ask the people who have the scriptures before you. That's the Jews and the Christians. And so that being the case, it assumes that the scriptures are uncorrupted. In any case, in my experience, Muslims do not deal with this problem because there is no way to deal with it. It would lead them right out of Islam. And so I remember bringing up this problem to a Muslim back when I was in college around 1982 or 3, and saying, look, if there was an original book that was the gospel that confirmed the Quran and was confirmed by it, where is it? It must have existed at the time of the beginnings of Islam because it's referred to in the Quran. Where is it now? And he says, oh, well, it's lost. And so I said to him, but look, we have the Gospels of the New Testament. We have the New Testament in general. That's the same as what it was before Islam. We have manuscripts predating the beginnings of Islam. And so consequently, That's what the Quran is referring Christians and Muslims to, and it doesn't confirm. And he would just wave it all away. He didn't, it kind of reminds me of when years ago, David Wood and I debated Anjem Chowdhury and Omar Bakri, two fairly prominent imams in Britain. Bakri is no longer in Britain and Chowdhury's in prison now. But at that time, they were pretty high-profile imams in Britain. And we debated them about the question of Muhammad's existence and the historicity of the Islamic texts. And they said, well, of course he existed. It's in the Quran. And that was it. That's as far as they could go. They didn't have the critical faculties to examine the question in any other way. And that's generally the case with the Islamic apologists today. They just really sidestep the issue and indicate that it's not even something that they really understand. They repeat that the Jews and Christians have corrupted their scriptures without any evidence of that fact, or deny in some other way that the Quran is referring to the scriptures of the Jews and the Christians, because it does say the Torah and the Gospel, and there is a Torah, but the Gospel is not actually one book, like as the Quran envisions it. And so some of them try to claim that this is indication of the corruption. But in terms of manuscripts and the texts, there isn't any evidence of this corruption. And so when you're talking about Muslims trying to convert Jews and Christians, they are generally working from the ignorance of those Jews and Christians. And particularly when it comes to Christians, they'll attack the idea of the Trinity and say something like, how is it that Jesus is praying in the New Testament? How could he be praying if he's God? Who's he praying to? And the answer is that he's somehow praying to himself, and that this is ridiculous. And therefore, the Islamic concept of Tawheed, of the absolute unity of Allah, is preferable to the Trinity. Now, of course, that's not really what the Trinity is. The Son is praying to the Father and so on, but they have to base it on these misunderstandings and misrepresentations in order to get any traction. And so it's extremely rare, if it ever happens at all, that you have a knowledgeable Jew or a knowledgeable Christian who understands his own faith convert to Islam, because the Quran is really a crude caricature of the Jewish and Christian scriptures. And for example, it defines the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, in the Christian view as Allah, Mary, and Jesus. And this is something that no Christians have ever believed. It says that the Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah, and no Jews have ever believed that Ezra is the son of God. And so consequently, it's hard for Jews and Christians who know what their religions teach to take it seriously.
Are there different versions? Are there different manuscripts of the Quran with textual variants? And my second part of that question is, how much do those textual variants differ from each other? Are they only minor, or are they major?
Yeah, they're mostly minor. As a matter of fact, I think all of them are pretty minor. They don't change the teachings of the religion, but they do contradict the Islamic apologist claim, which you can readily find, that the Quran has never changed. And one example of the truth of it is that every manuscript, everywhere, and every copy since the invention of the printing press has been identical. You can find Yasser Qadi, the prominent imam in America, saying this on a video that I've reposted many times with commentary on Twitter or X, because in the book, The Critical Quran, I actually put variant readings. Not even all of the variant readings, because some of them get to be kind of complicated to explain. But I wanted to make the point that there were textual variants, and so I included as many as I could in order to show that the claim that the Quran's text has been miraculously preserved is simply not borne out by the facts. And you have a lot of Islamic apologists spreading disinformation about this issue, saying there's no. I saw a guy yesterday, as a matter of fact, saying it's like the difference between the English spelling of color with a U and the American spelling without the U. That's not the case at all. There are cases where the textual variants actually change the meaning. And so consequently, it cannot be maintained that the text has been miraculously preserved or that the variations are minor, insignificant matters of dialect. But there are no major doctrinal differences in the variants.
So could you tell the audience, for those that don't really know much about this story, how do Muslims actually think that they got the Quran? What story do they tell about that?
Oh, well, that comes from the Islamic tradition, which dates from the 9th century, and says that in the 7th century, in the year 610, Muhammad, who was an Arabian merchant from Mecca in southwestern Arabia, was praying in a cave on Mount Hira outside of Mecca, and he was 40 years old at the time, and a being appeared to him. And it's interesting to note that while Islamic tradition almost universally, actually, not completely, almost universally identifies this being with the angel Gabriel, the earliest available versions of the story, they do not say that it's Gabriel. They say that somebody appeared to him and said, recite. And he said, I can't recite, I can't read. And so the being says, recite more urgently. And he repeats that he can't read. And finally, it's pressing him so hard that he thought he was going to die and insisting that he recite. And goes on to say the beginning of chapter 96 of the Quran, recite in the name of him who created man from clots of blood, and so on and so on. And that is the beginning of Islam, when the angel Gabriel began to give these messages to Muhammad. And the messages were not from Gabriel, they were from Allah. They are the perfect book, the mother of the book, the al-Kitab, which exists forever with Allah in paradise. And over the next 23 years, Gabriel appears to Muhammad at various times, not in any regular times, but at times when nobody expects, or when he's in a pickle or whatever, and gives him various portions of the recitation, the Quran. And after he dies, actually 20 years after he died, it is collected together, and that is the Quran we have today. That's the story.
So how did we actually get the Quran, and when?
Well, that's a bit of a mystery. The standard story, as I just noted, is that in the year 653, Uthman, the caliph, the successor of Muhammad as the leader of the Muslims, called together all of the people who had memorized parts of the Quran and got it all written down, burned the variants, supposedly destroying all the variant readings that existed at that time, and standardized the text, distributed the standardized text to all the provinces that were then part of the Islamic world. That's the story. But there are holes in the narrative because, for one thing, the Quran, if it existed in 653, and of course existed from 632 in its entirety, although it wasn't put into its final form until 653, it's never quoted. And we have the Arabs pouring out of Arabia in the 630s and conquering Egypt, conquering the Holy Land, conquering Syria, conquering North Africa, conquering Persia, conquering part of India, Sind, and nowhere in any of that for 60 some years do they mention the Quran or quote it. And so the obvious answer to this mystery is at very least that the Quran did not exist at that time. Now, there are people who respond to this by saying that we have manuscripts of the Quran, like the Sanaa manuscript in Yemen, that have been carbon dated to this period. And so that destroys this argument. But that only just makes it worse, because then you've got the question of, okay, they actually did have it, and yet they never mention that it exists, much less quote it. Or it's possible that, of course, the carbon dating could be wrong, because carbon dating isn't as reliable as a lot of people assume it to be. But it's also noteworthy that the Sanaa manuscript has a number of variants from the standard text as it exists today. And also that if the Quran does not come from Muhammad, then one possibility is that it could have been put together from extant sources. And this is the contention of scholars such as Christoph Luxemburg and others who have found Aramaic substrata in the Quranic text and contend that it's not actually Arabic originally at all, but Aramaic, and that it makes a lot of the problematic passages not the kind that I was referring to earlier, but ones that are problematic linguistically, that are ungrammatical or even just nonsense or completely impenetrable in Arabic, that they become clear if you change the diacritical marks so that they are read as Aramaic. Anyway, that would explain then something like the Sanaa manuscript, that it may be some publication that was a source for the Quran and not the Quran itself. But in any case, if it was, we still don't have anybody using it. We still don't have anybody quoting it. And it's extremely strange. We have, in the beginning of the 8th century, we have John of Damascus and another Christian writer talking about the Quran, and both of them indicate that they don't have it in its final form either. Because John, he speaks about how he's read the writings of the Muslims. And so he says, he doesn't say, I've read the Quran. He says, I've read the writing of the cow and the writing of the table and the writing of the camel of Allah. The cow and the table are chapters of the Quran, but the camel of Allah is not. And so here again, the most obvious explanation is that John's Quran, maybe John didn't have the Quran at all, but a collection of books before they were bound together and made into one book. Or he had the one book, but it didn't correspond to the book they have today. And the other one says the same thing. The other Christian writer gives the same impression, where he says, I've read the Quran. He says Quran. He's one of the first to say it. And I've also read Surah Al-Baqarah, which is chapter 2 of the Quran as we have it today. Now, you just don't say that if you're reading a book. I read that book and I read chapter 4 of it also. That's not how people talk. And so if the Quran existed at that time, it likely was very different from the Quran we have now.
What does the Quran say about Jesus?
It says that he was a prophet, that he was the nephew of Moses, that he was sinless. Well, it doesn't, the Islamic tradition says he was sinless, but it does say that he was born of a virgin, which it doesn't say about Muhammad. And it says that he was taken up into heaven after his death, although it does not say, it says he was not crucified. He was just taken up. He was, it says they did not kill, the Jews say, we have killed the Messiah. And then the Quran goes on to say, they did not kill or crucify him, but it seemed so to them. And this is picking up on the Gnostic Christian idea. And the Gnostics were Christian heretics of the early centuries of Christianity. And they said that physical matter, like bodies, were evil in and of themselves. And so the Savior was a disembodied being who came into physical existence in order to save all the disembodied souls of the righteous. And that was Jesus. This is according to the Gnostic Christians. And so Jesus did not have a physical body. You could pass your hand right through him. This is according to the Gnostic literature. And so there is a Gnostic writing called the Second Treatise of the Great Seth, which has the crucifixion happening, and it's Thomas the Apostle on the cross instead of Jesus. Why Thomas? Because you may, if you've read the Gospels of the New Testament, you know that Thomas is called the twin, but it never says who he's the twin of. And in the Gnostic literature, he is called Judas Thomas and called the twin of Jesus. And it says that it was he who was crucified, and they thought they were crucifying Jesus when they were actually crucifying Judas Thomas, the twin of Jesus. That's the Gnostic Gospels. So the Gnostic Gospel is clearly a source for the Qur'an, where it says they didn't kill or crucify him, but it appeared so to them. And the Islamic tradition, actually, some Islamic traditions say that it was Judas Iscariot who was crucified in Jesus's place and made to look like him. And this is a clear confusion between Judas Thomas and Judas Iscariot. But in any case, that only reinforces the dependence on the Gnostic Gospels.
What does the Quran say about Abraham, and does the Quran change any details about Abraham's character?
One of the main things the Quran says about Abraham is that he is a Muslim. It says that the Jews and the Christians argue about Abraham, but he was not either a Jew or a Christian. He was a Muslim. And you might wonder, how is it that Abraham could be a Muslim if he's hundreds of years before Muhammad? And this is the foundation of the Islamic idea that all of the prophets of the Bible were Muslims, including Jesus. And that it was the wicked Jews and Christians who twisted the teachings of those prophets in order to create Judaism and Christianity. And so Abraham is a Muslim, and he teaches Islam. Then later on, the followers of Abraham, out of their hatred for Muhammad, they create Judaism. And that is a twisted, hijacked, adulterated version of the real teachings of the real Abraham. That's according to Islam. But the Abraham in the Quran is not the same as the father of many nations in the book of Genesis. For example, in chapter 65 of the Quran, it says that you have an excellent example in Abraham. That is, you should imitate Abraham. Now, that's striking because that's what it says in chapter 33, verse 21 about Muhammad, that Muhammad is the excellent example. And that is a full stop. It's excellent example, period. Muhammad is the excellent example. It's been taken in Islamic tradition to mean that everything Muhammad does is right, and everything Muhammad does is something that the believers should imitate. But in the case of Abraham in chapter 65, verse 4, it says, except, Abraham is an excellent example, except when he says to his, First, Abraham is an excellent example when he says to his family, there will be enmity and hatred between us and you forever because you don't worship Allah. But he's not an excellent example. He's an excellent example in everything except when he says to his father, but I'll pray for you because you shouldn't pray for the unbelievers. And so it's kind of a passage about how you should be unkind to the unbelievers, not like Abraham, who said he would pray for his father.
I'd like to come back to the Quran's take on Jesus. Why do you think it states that Jesus Jesus' mother Mary is the sister of Moses. Like, and how do they try to explain that? How do Muslims try to explain that problem away by apparently putting Jesus and Moses really close in time like that?
Yeah, it says it addresses her a couple of times as sister of Aaron, not of Moses, but of course Aaron is Moses' brother, so it's the same thing. And so if Mary is the sister of Adam, then Jesus is the nephew of Moses. And this is very clear in the Quran, really. But early on, it becomes something that Muslims were challenged about. And so in the 9th century Hadith collections, there are stories about Muhammad being challenged about this, because clearly in the 9th century Muslims were being challenged about this. So they made up a story about Muhammad saying that this is just an honorary title, an honorific. To call Mary a sister of Aaron is high praise, but it's not literal. Doesn't really mean that she's the sister of Aaron. What it comes from is a confusion of the names, because in Arabic, the name Miriam, that is the sister of Aaron and Moses, is the same name as Mary, Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's both Mariam. And so he hears Mariam and he figures there is only the one, and that must be that Mary is the mother of Jesus and the sister of Aaron and Moses. So the idea of the honorary title, this is what Muslims will tell you to this day, that it's just a way of praising Mary to call her sister of Aaron. But this is contradicted by the fact that chapter 3 of the Quran is called Ahle Imran, the family of Imran, the people of Imran. Who is Imran? Imran is Amram, the father of Moses, according to the Quran. And so here again, you've got this chapter that's called the family of Imran, and it's got stories all about Mary and Moses. And it's very clear that it's not just an honorific, but that Mary is considered to be part of the Ahle Imran, the people of Imran. And so it just doesn't wash the Hadith's explanation for the title. Or it's not really a title at all. It's just who she was.
What do you make about the Quran talking about the moon and the moon splitting?
Yeah, well, that's just more of the ludicrousness of modern day Islamic apologetics, that you have the splitting of the moon in the Quran. And so how is it that the moon could have been split and yet it's obviously whole? Well, you see, when the astronauts went to the moon in 1969, they took some soil and brought it back to Earth. And so they split the moon, you see, and this was fulfillment of the Islamic prophecy. But in actual fact, the passage in question is just about all these apocalyptic events that are supposedly going to attend the advent of the final, the seal of the prophets, who is identified as Muhammad for the most part. And consequently, it's becomes another indication of the falsehood and failure of Islam. That, well, didn't get that moon split, did we?
What does the Quran say about Joseph?
Joseph, the brother of, I mean, one of those 12 brothers. The I'm blanking on the guy. The son of who is it that he's the
Joseph, son of Judah?
Yeah. And the story is in I always forget, but it's early on. Hang on. The story is told in chapter 12 of the Quran, which
I meant to say Joseph, son of Jacob, not Judah.
Yeah, that's the guy. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm blanking on the guy myself anyway. But in any case, the story that is pretty much the same story as in the Bible, where he's one of these 12 brothers, and he is the one who has a particular favor from God, and the others are jealous and they try to kill him. And then he shows up and he becomes a slave of Pharaoh in Egypt, and the brothers show up and so on. That story is retold in chapter 12 of the Quran. And so in general, it is just another example of the Quran's tendency to take biblical stories and to recast them as essentially parables about Muhammad, that the prophets all are told, the stories of them are told as they come to the people, and the people reject them and make fun of them, and then they end up being vindicated by Allah. And so you better get with it, because Allah is going to vindicate the new prophet and punish you all for rejecting him. That's basically the story of all the prophets, told again and again with minor variations in the Quran.
Now, what about Joseph, the New Testament Joseph, the father of Jesus?
Gee, I don't know if he's in there. Mary is born of a virgin. Trying to remember, can't think of any passages about Joseph, the father of Jesus, offhand. We have various stories of the Annunciation in chapter 3 and chapter 19. And what's noteworthy about them, I suppose, immediately is that nowhere is Jesus identified as the Son of God. Nowhere does it say the child who is born to you is going to be the Son of God, as it says in the Gospels, because that would contradict the Islamic presentation. And so it's just a virgin birth with no real significance. There's no real point to it. If Muhammad is the greatest prophet and the final prophet and the seal of the prophets, logically you would think that there wouldn't be another prophet who was not as great who would be experiencing all these favors from Allah, such as being born of a virgin. The fact that Jesus is born of a virgin in the Quran and Muhammad is not, is an indication that what we have is a kind of a jumbled mess, really, of Christian theology, Jewish theology, Zoroastrian theology, and all of it brought together. Some of the contradictions ironed out, like the references to the Son of God removed and so on, but some of them left there. And one of them that's left there is the fact that Jesus is born of a virgin and Muhammad is not, even though Muhammad is supposed to be a greater prophet. But I know this doesn't deal with Joseph in particular. I don't think he's in there. I could be forgetting something, but offhand, I don't remember anything about. He's certainly not a big player in the Quran.
Does the Quran, let me rephrase. What does the Quran say about early Islamic Islamic battles, and are there any historical issues of any of those battles that it talks about?
Well, all of the battles that it talks about, the primary evidence we have that they took place at all is the Quran, and so it ain't necessarily so. It may be that these battles are created in order to make various theological points, just like much of what Muhammad says and does is created to make various theological points. So you have, for example, the Battle of Badr, which is described in the Quran. It is the first great battle of Islamic history, when the pagan Arab polytheistic Meccans came out to wage war against the Muslims, and they had quite a significantly larger and more powerful force than the Muslims did, and consequently they were fairly assured of victory, but the Muslims ended up winning. And this was, in Islamic history, absolutely decisive. It assured the survival of the community, and it established a very important theological point, and that is that there's a one-to-one equation. Piety will equal success. Impiety will equal destruction in this world as well as the next. Now, this is a sharp departure from Judaism and Christianity. All over the Jewish scriptures, you've got people lamenting and wondering why the wicked prosper, and so on. There's psalms devoted to that, and other passages all about how the enemies of the people of God have prevailed over them, and why is it that God allows this, and so on. You've got the Babylonians going to come in the book of Habakkuk to overwhelm a wicked and hasty nation, it says, and they're going to overwhelm the Israelites, and so on. And in the New Testament, of course, you've got the crucifixion, which is the primary indication that, and of course, the book of Ecclesiastes, I should have mentioned, in the Jewish scriptures, but also in the New Testament with the crucifixion and so on. You've got it very clear that the that piety does not lead to earthly success. It doesn't rule it out, but there's just no guarantee that the good people will have good things happen to them and the bad people will suffer. But the Quran says they will. The Quran says the good people will be blessed by Allah in this world as well as the next, and the unbelievers will suffer in this world as well as the next. So, what happened at Badr? An insignificant force defeated a much larger force. And it says in the Quran, when you fought, it was Allah who was fighting, and he sent angels to fight alongside the Muslims. And so the lesson is that if you are religious, if you obey Allah, you will have success in this world and the next. Not just in the next, but in this world also. And if you are a sinner, you will suffer in this world as well as the next. Now, this is even guaranteed in every call to prayer. When you hear from the minaret, the muezzin, and he's calling the Muslims to come to pray in the mosque 5 times a day, he says, come to prayer, come to success. Prayer is success, because you're going to get success in this world if you pray. And this creates a lot of cognitive dissonance today for Muslims, because they look around in the world, and the richest countries in the world, the most successful and most powerful, are not the Muslim countries, which is not the way it ought to be, according to the Quran and according to the lesson of the Battle of Badr. And it is a real source of fanaticism in the Islamic world, that they think, well, maybe I'm just not doing enough. Even though I'm devoting my whole life to Allah, obviously it's still not enough. And so I have to try to do more. And so that's what leads to jihad violence, because Muhammad is quoted in a hadith as saying that there's no deed that's greater than jihad. And consequently, if you really want to please God the most, then go jihad.
What do you make of the story in the Quran about the cow?
The cow is the name of chapter 2 of the Quran. And it is the longest chapter, arguably the most important chapter, but it really doesn't have anything to do with the cow. The chapter names, for the most part, in the Quran are random. There is something in the chapter that the whole chapter is referred to as, but it doesn't really have anything to do with the subject. And so there is a strange story. It looks as if some parts of it have dropped out of the Quran manuscripts, because there is a strange story of Allah sending a cow, sending a camel too, but that's another thing. And it appears to have something to do with the golden calf in the Old Testament from the Sinai, but it's not exactly the same thing, and it's not all explained. Much of the Quran is said as if the people who are hearing it already know the story and they don't need it all filled in. It's also noteworthy that when you're talking about the Moses on Mount Sinai, it's a different mountain in the Quran, but in any case, when he comes down, he doesn't have 10 commandments in the Quran. That's one part of the story that's left out. In all the tellings, and there are many retellings of the story of the Exodus, and there are various details in some versions of the story that aren't told in others, and so on. And no 10 commandments anywhere. And that seems to me to be because there are no moral absolutes in Islam. What's good for Islam is what's good. And so if lying, cheating, stealing, and killing are good for Islam under various circumstances, then they're good. That's it. And so the cow, anyway, is chapter 2 of the Quran. But other than that, it has no tremendous significance.
I'd like to recap on what the Quran says about Muhammad. So what exactly does the Quran say about Muhammad? I know you mentioned before that it doesn't really say very much, but can you remind the audience again for those that don't know about that?
Yeah, there are only 4 passages in the Quran that even mention Muhammad by name. There are hundreds of passages in the Quran that refer to the messenger or the prophet, but that person is not named. And so everybody assumes that it's Muhammad. And as a matter of fact, when you read other English translations of the Quran, many of them just put in, "Oh, Muhammad," when it doesn't say that in the Arabic text. And so a lot of people in English, in the English speaking world, thinks that the Quran is all talking to Muhammad all the time. That ain't necessarily so. It's addressing some messenger or prophet. It's possible. I think that for a variety of reasons, that there could have been any number of messengers or prophets, and their stories were all folded into the Quran. And Muhammad itself may have been a title, but that's another story. In any case, Muhammad is mentioned, the actual name, 4 times in the Quran, but in none of those do we get any actual detail about who he was or what his life is all about. All of the things that we think we know about Muhammad and his life and what he did come from 9th century literature 200 years after his death. And so you want to know about Muhammad, you can't find out from the Quran.
Does the Quran even state when the Muhammad it mentions 4 times even lived?
No, there isn't anything about him at all. I mean, it's, for example, it says in chapter 48, verse 29, one of those 4, it says, "Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Those who follow him are ruthless to unbelievers, merciful to one another." And so it's essentially just a call to be mean and nasty to unbelievers and kind to the Muslims. But it doesn't say anything about Muhammad at all, except that he's the messenger of Allah.
Do we have any more information at all about the messenger or messengers that the Quran is talking about, or not really?
Well, all of the prophets of the Old Testament who are mentioned in the Quran, Abraham, Joseph, David, Moses, Jesus, all of Solomon, all of them are messengers of Allah. Noah, and they all are, like I said earlier, they all their stories follow the same track. That they get a message from Allah, they go and tell it to people, the people scorn and mock and reject them, but then they turn out to be right, and the people are sorry because they're going to hell or whatever, or they are getting their cities destroyed. But then by then it's too late. And that's and so the Quran is full of messengers. There are also some other messengers who are mentioned, and their stories follow the same track, but they are mentioned in the Quran and we don't have any idea who they are other than that. They're not in the Bible, like Hud, Saleh. Shoot, there's another one I'm forgetting, but anyway, there are several extra biblical prophets or messengers in the Quran, but they don't really shed any light any more than the others. They're all just, as I said, all of their stories are essentially parables about how the messenger gets rejected, and boy, are they sorry later.
In my final question, from your experience, do Muslims tend to look at the Quran or assume things about the Quran, not not just from assumptions that were made later, but also from embellishments from the Hadith? So, in other words, are they often reading the Quran from reinterpreting it from the lens of additional information from the Hadith and other texts?
Oh yeah, absolutely, Jacob. Because see, the Quran is unintelligible, really, in many areas without the Hadith, and particularly the portions of the Hadith that deal with the Asbab Nuzul, that is, the circumstances of revelation, that purport to show when various passages and under what circumstances various passages of the Quran were revealed. The idea is that you want to know what's going on in this passage of the Quran, you go to the Hadith and to the Asbab Nuzul, and it'll tell you. But there isn't actually any indication that those explanations are accurate. And there are many signs, especially the fact that sometimes there are two contradictory explanations of a single passage. There are a lot of indications that these explanations for what's happening in the Quran were written in order just to explain the Quran and don't have any other basis. The Quran by itself, there are some Muslims today who will say that they only go by the Quran and they reject the Hadith. And this is understandable because a lot of the horrible things about Islam come from the Hadith, although the Quran has plenty on its own. But the problem with that idea is that you cannot really understand the Quran without having it filled in. And a lot of Muslims don't even realize, because they're so used to reading the Quran through the Hadith and understanding the passages based on what the Hadith says they mean. And they don't even realize anymore that they are dependent on the Hadith in this way. Consequently, you cannot separate the two, although the Quran seems to have come quite a bit before the Hadith. Actually, I don't think it came as far. It is as much older than the Hadith than most people assume. But in any case, the one depends upon the other, and you can't separate them.
So before we close, I'm going to take the super chat question from Frank Sidebottom. Thank you for your super chat. Salman Rushdie was recently violently attacked for the satanic verses. Please explain why. Great show.
Thanks, Frank. The satanic verses were a passage of, according to Islamic tradition, a passage of the revelation that was given to Muhammad, in which he said that the three goddesses of the Quraysh, the pagan Arabs of Mecca, were the daughters of Allah, and thus worthy of veneration. And this united the pagan Arabs of Mecca with the Muslims and settled and these are the people who are fighting the wars against each other, like the Battle of Badr. So it settled the war, or all the wars. But then Muhammad, according to the traditions, realized that he had contradicted the strict monotheism that he had preached earlier. And so he got everybody together again and he said, look, Satan inspired those verses about the daughters of Allah. And so they're canceled now, and Allah has given us these others. And so they're not in the Quran as they were originally given. And nowadays Muslims say, oh, this story is fake. It was made by Islamophobes, but it's actually amply attested in Islamic tradition. And that's called the satanic verses. So like 1500 years later, a British Indian novelist, Salman Rushdie, in 1989 wrote a book called The Satanic Verses, where he takes this story and he makes it into this kind of fictional fantasia for his own purposes, but he's certainly mocking Muhammad, the prophet of Islam. And so the Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic of Iran, wrote a fatwa saying that his blood was halal, that is, that he could lawfully be killed, and called for his death, actually put a bounty on his head. And so Salman Rushdie went into hiding, and then after years went by and nothing had happened, he came out of hiding. He started to make public appearances, and so just a couple of years ago, he was about to speak at Chautauqua, the speaker program in New York, and he was attacked by a Muslim who was acting upon the fatwa of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And so he was not killed, but he was very seriously injured, lost an eye, lost the use of one of his arms, and he's an old man now, but in any case, that's why he was targeted.
Frank says Rushdie. Sorry for this misspelling. No problem. Yeah. So again, the link to purchase the Critical Quran will be in the description below and a pinned comment. And that being said, Robert Spencer, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks. Good talking with you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.